This super OP fire build does a ton of damage in Wo Long Fallen Dynasty and is very fun to play. It's one of the most fun builds I've played, and I've played this specific build at least 40 hours. You have abilities to throw fireballs and do a massive amount of damage with spells and weapons in general to every enemy you face. It helps you run through regular enemies as well as smaller boss enemies and even large bosses at the end of some of these missions that are really hard to beat. These videos take a while to make, so if you could scroll down really quick and hit the subscribe button. And I'm going to go through now how to create this build and how to use it to be super OP and do a ton of damage. As you can see here for the base build, I have Fire Virtue at 50 points. This is kind of the cap to when it starts becoming more or less worth it to also invest in other skills as well. You can see my element abilities at the bottom. I have a whopping 281 fire and 130 wood, as well as a bunch of damage bonuses in general that increase the overall damage that I'm going to do. So currently I'm running the dual rooster crowing halberds. Now at first I was running these dual marquise halberds, but you definitely want to make sure you're using a dual halberd set because of the massive fire bonus that you do get with these weapons. Now, if you'll notice, this is a 4-star weapon, meaning that we have 4 spots at the bottom for actual abilities that go on this weapon. Some of the big ones that I put on both my weapons are damage dealt, which gives you a 2.4% damage dealt bonus, as well as flame attack power and lightning attack power, which I may or may not switch up later, but I'm putting points in wood, so that kind of just makes sense to add any extra damage that I can. You can also put this on another weapon as well. I was just testing these weapons out, but generally I would have another 4-star weapon here with similar abilities on them. Same thing goes for the bow. So for the bow, I added lightning and flame attack power, and then again flame attack power, damage dealt bonuses, and lightning attack power. On my actual gear, I have basically the same thing, meaning more damage dealt bonus, more flame attack power, and burns accumulation on enemies, which is huge because when you hit enemies with fire spells or hit them with your sword after a fire ability is used, you're going to do additional burn damage to them, which although is passive, hits very hard over time. Again, as you can see, more gear with burns, damage dealt, flame attack power, and all of my gear has this, basically boosting the amount of damage that I can do. For your accessories, you're just going to have to find good accessories. So I got a damage dealt accessory here to bump up my damage dealt percentage. Now for the skills, like I mentioned earlier, this is a melee / fire build. So I had 50 points in fire virtue, and then I've been just putting points in wood virtue for the sake of my HP, spell duration, and spirit defense. You can see here I have 281 points in the fire virtue element abilities down there, as well as big bumps to my spirit gain rate and spirit consumption rate. As far as skills go, obviously at this point in the game, but there are 4 really big skills that you should be using. The first one is bursting fireball. Now I've seen some builds that may actually not include this, but I don't see why, because this spell is, in my opinion, the most useful and maybe the most OP spell for this build. So the way this spell works is essentially you throw a fireball and then it bursts into multiple fireballs. Each one of those fireballs upon contact does a ton of damage, and each one of those fireballs also causes burning on the enemies as well. Another must-have skill is Flame Weapon. Flame Weapon is going to obviously enchant your weapon with flame, and with all the bonuses we have to flame on this build, as well as the burn accumulation on enemies, if you pop this, you're going to be doing double the damage, and you can 2 or 3 shot regular enemies without a problem. The third ability is Engulfing Inferno, where you slam the ground, and it basically spreads fire on the ground, and then 5 pillars shoot up, doing damage to everyone in the area. So once you get enemies around in an area, this is a solid skill to use, and it only costs half the spirit of Bursting Fireball. Bursting Fireball is the go-to in my opinion, but Engulfing Inferno also is great. And the last skill is Overpower Burst. So Overpower Burst is going to increase the damage dealt by the next spell or martial arts skill that you use. And you're going to use Bursting Fireball just as an example. This is going to do a ton of damage to this boss. If you use Overpower Burst, it's going to significantly increase the damage that Bursting Fireball does. And you can kind of play these off of one another over and over. So you can cast Overpower Burst, then you can cast Bursting Fireball. You can back up a little bit and redo this combo, and basically it's going to increase this cast damage by a lot, and I mean a lot. Another ability you could use instead of Engulfing Inferno is the General Blasting Flare, mainly because this does a decent amount of damage, and being that you have all the fire bonuses that you do, it's going to do a solid amount of damage, and it's a 3 morale rank skill, meaning you'll have ability to use this skill right off the bat when you start any mission, which is big because otherwise you have to wait until morale rank 7 just to even get flame weapon. So if you use this instead of Engulfing Inferno, you'll have a skill to use right off the bat, and it'll be a quick, run up, smack somebody with it, it's done. Now, as far as Divine Beast, you really have 2 options. You could use this. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name. It applies flame damage additionally to your weapon, increases automatic spirit recovery, and the HP damage that you deal to enemies. So this can be a really good option. I still currently run Qinglong, which when used drops a spot on the ground where it's almost infinite healing and it recovers allies in your area. I use this for boss fights. It's always been super useful, so that's what I'm going to stick with using for now. So you can see I have additional 95 flame attack power, an additional 11% damage dealt overall, plus 27% for burns accumulation on enemies, which is huge for this build. The first ability is Bursting Fireball. This is the best ability in this build by far. Bursting Fireball is going to throw a fireball at enemies and then expand into other small fireballs, causing a ton of regular damage and burn damage on enemies. You can see I can literally one-shot multiple enemies with this thing because it is that good. You can throw it into a large group of enemies or at a singular enemy, and it takes them out almost every % of the time. When you're facing bosses, you can kind of back up, throw a fireball, back up, throw another fireball, and between the direct damage that it does when it explodes and the burning damage, I think it is by far one of, if not the best ability in the game to use. I mean, the damage that it does by itself is insane, especially not even considering comboing it into other abilities. It helps you get bosses super low, so that way you can finish them off and make it really easy. The next ability is Flame Weapon. So Flame Weapon is an empowering flame spell that makes your weapon have flame ability, meaning with how we spec'd out this build, you do a ton of flame damage to enemies this way, and you can walk up right before a fight, cast it, it's super fast and quick to do, and then start attacking an enemy, and in 2 or 3 hits, they're basically gone. You can combo this with other things, obviously, like the fireball when using it against bosses. So after you hit a boss with a fireball or 2, then eventually you want to get melee damage on your enemy and be able to do fatal strikes. So you can cast Flame Weapon, do a ton of damage, and that damage helps build up their meter that quick. And that extra damage helps fill up their meter even quicker. If you have Flame Weapon activated on fatal strikes for enemies, such as bosses as an example, you do increased fire damage again on those attacks. So make sure you have that activated when you go to do fatal strikes on bosses, because eventually not only does the damage build up from regular melee attacks to make fatal strikes easier to get, you end up doing a lot more damage overall. The next ability is Engulfing Inferno, meaning you hit the ground and it shoots 5 pillars of fire out of the ground, doing a ton of damage to enemies. You can combo this obviously with other abilities, but when able to hit 1 or more enemies at any given time, it does a ton of burst damage all at once. The final ability is Overpower Burst, meaning once you cast it very quick, you'll then be able to do a significant amount more damage on the next attack or martial art that you do, meaning any attack or spells you do after this are going to have increased damage. You can pair this with Fireball for an increased amount of damage, so cast it and then cast Fireball on an enemy or boss, and it's going to do an insane amount of extra damage and a lot of extra burning damage as well to the enemy, meaning it's going to make boss fights a lot more simple for you, especially considering they're always right before battle flags. This is also an amazing combo to use for large boss fights, so you can go into boss fights with reinforcements and kind of take the enemy's attention off of you. Once you take the enemy's attention off of you, you can combo these spells back and forth to do an increased amount of fireball damage to the enemy from a distance, not have to worry about getting hit, and being able to beat bosses a lot easier. If you like the build, make sure to drop a like on the video or comment if you think there's improvements you can make to this build or another build. That being said, thanks.